Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts TNC's webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, and influencers from New England and around the world. I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Massachusetts State Director and your host, Deb Markowitz. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. And we also know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and planet. TNC was officially launched 70 years ago and evolved out of a movement that sought to change public sentiment and national policy towards the need to protect nature for nature's sake. One of the grandfathers of the modern conservation movement, Aldo Leopold, described in his book, The Sand County Almanac, and if you haven't read it, it really is a classic. He talked about the affinity between art and nature. He said, our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty, but it expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. I love that, like these values as yet uncaptured by language. To me, it feels like he's talking about that spiritual experience, that deep experience we get in nature, which is similar to that experience we get with art. Leopold's hope was that through artistic depictions of wild places, we could stimulate a cultural change that valued the protection of nature. And so to that end today, we're going to be talking about the intersection between art and nature with Springfield Museum art curator, Maggie North. Maggie has spent 6 years at the Springfield Museum working with the rich collections at the Michelle and Donald D'Amore Museum of Fine Arts and the George Walter Vincent Smith Art Museum. And Maggie's going to be discussing the role of landscape and land and landscape art and art history, and how art's critical visual messages inspire land protection. She's also going to show some key pieces from the Springfield collection, as well as works from other major collections, and talk about how they relate to land preservation and conservation. And then she's going to take your questions. So as you think of questions for Maggie, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I just want to thank you all again for joining us. And Maggie, why don't we dive in?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Deb. I'm so thrilled to be with you here today for this Nature Connects webinar. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. All right. So as Deb mentioned, I'll be discussing landscapes and the land today. And I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the Springfield Museums in Springfield, Massachusetts are located on the traditional land of the Eastern Algonquian peoples, including the Pocumtuck, Agawam, Nipmuc, Nonotuck, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it and continue to steward it today. As the title of my talk suggests, I will be discussing the connection between the land, the very earth that we inhabit, and a long history of American art that addresses pictures and makes use of ideas about landscape. I hope to illuminate and expand upon a history that is intertwined with ideas about the beauty and the value of nature, as well as the politics and ownership of space. I'll focus today on works of art that do factor into the history of preservation and conservation by drawing on works in the Springfield collection and in other collections around the country. And this mode of inquiry that I'll be adapting today is one that is termed eco-criticism. It's one that forces us to look at landscape art in terms of the land. It's a term that's borrowed from the field of literature, and in art history, it describes an approach to viewing art and artifacts as embodying environmental conditions and beliefs. It's a way of thinking that actually decenters many of our typical art historical markers. So artist biographies, styles, isms that you see on museum labels, those become singular elements in a much larger framework. And as this fantastic quote by Alan Braddock, who was an early adapter of eco-criticism in art history and remains a leading figure in the field, outlines, such an approach recognizes that the world we inhabit is not exclusively or presumptively the province of human beings. And that's really important. So as we look at art history and as we look at this integration of eco-criticism, one of our tasks is going to be to bring that connection between art and environment to the fore. And although eco-criticism has really only become a popular field of inquiry in art history in the past 3 decades, it's related to this much older idea. As Albert Einstein so eloquently and very succinctly put it, arts and sciences are branches of the same tree. And despite the binaries that we might encounter, like nature versus culture, or left brain versus right brain, artists and natural historians have long shared an interest in studying and documenting nature. So today, as we dive into our look at the history of landscape and the land with an eye on eco-criticism, I'd like to begin with one of the United States' most consequential painters of the American West. And you can see him on this slide. In 1859, Albert Bierstadt became one of the first artists to accompany the Army expedition of Colonel Frederick W. Lander to map a wagon trail across the Rocky Mountains. And these were mountains that had been called America's Alps by travelers. Bierstadt was a perfect fit for the job because he had studied in Germany, in Dusseldorf, and he had traveled to the Swiss Alps. Upon his return to the States, he became fascinated with this idea of creating romantic depictions of nature. And so the piece you see on this slide, Storm in the Rocky Mountains, is a work that you can find at the Brooklyn Museum. It's over 12 feet long, and it exemplified his early approach. This was made from sketches that the artist created in 1863 when he made his second trip to the Rockies. And you can see that it's a panoramic view. It features these craggy, exaggerated peaks and a tumultuous sky, dramatic lighting. This is a painting that was intended to elicit emotional reactions from the viewer when it was exhibited back in New York. And for many on the East Coast, paintings like this one, and by contemporaries of Bierstadt like Thomas Moran, functioned as visual introductions to this idea of American landscape, and especially the America that could be encountered in the Rockies or on the other side of the Rockies. And those who weren't able to see paintings of Bierstadt's in person may have seen prints of those particular paintings, or prints that borrowed from the style and motifs which he became most famous for. So you see elks, you see majestic mountains, trees, changeable skies in this print. And this is a print that would have been mass produced and purchased by middle-class Americans for their homes. It was produced by the New York City-based lithography firm, Curator and Ives, and it's located in Springfield's collection. It illustrates a sort of amalgamated view of, quote, American mountain scenery, as you see on the bottom of the print. And it was probably drawn and designed by a staff artist located in New York who had never traveled to the Rockies. So he was looking at Bierstadt paintings or looking at prints, looking at other works of art, and even perhaps early photographs that had come back from those who had traveled to that area. And it's not really so much about a specific place, you know, the Rockies, the Tetons, or another mountain range, but about this idea of American mountain scenery, an idea of what America looked like, and the connection between America, American identity, and landscape. So here we see another painting by Bierstadt. This is in the collection of the George Walter Vincent Smith Art Museum at the Springfield Museums, and it was inspired by Bierstadt's third trip west in the 1870s. It depicts the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is located about 15 miles north of Yosemite. And in this work, the viewer is situated really at eye level, as if we're right there in the painting, standing on this broad open plain. trees at the left and at the right, frame our view. And it's a view of a landscape devoid of people, buildings, or signs of civilization. The scene is wild, it's alluring, and it's bathed in this heavenly glow. But while this landscape may look untouched, we must acknowledge that by the time that Bierstadt had arrived in this region, the United States Army had already expelled the Awanichi people who once occupied this area. And so therefore, it's one of several absolutely majestic depictions of landscape that affirmed problematic ideas of the landscape as being blessed by God and available to Anglo-American travelers. And so Bierstadt's legacy is complicated, though certainly complicated by ideas about manifest destiny. The work did enable many Americans to see the land as stunning, as important, as more than a treasure trove of resources to be exploited. And especially when considered in the context of the words of contemporary advocates, such as Thoreau, who wrote in 1862, "The West, which I speak of, is but another name for the wild. And what I have been preparing to say is that in wildness is the preservation of the world." So we can see that these images of wilderness were powerful visual tools that impacted public opinion and were essential to the early conservation movement in the United States. And as we look back at this image today, there's a bit of an irony about it because the Hetch Hetchy Valley no longer exists. The river that ran through it was dammed in the 1920s to make a reservoir for San Francisco. But a lot of the land that Bierstadt did depict does remain and remains a part of our national conversations today. These paintings by Bierstadt are sometimes used in marketing material for the national parks, and Bierstadt paintings have become the subjects of stamps that are also distributed today by the National Park Service. So it's difficult for us to address the history of landscape and art and conservation in the national parks without mentioning Ansel Adams. This seminal photographer is pictured here using his large format camera. Ansel Adams photographed some of the most beautiful sights in the United States. And he believed that an encounter with nature could turn a tourist into a conservationist. And that was an experience that Adams himself had when he visited Yosemite Valley with his family in 1916. At that time, he had been reading the words of conservationists such as John Muir, who wrote in 1901 that the wilderness is necessary and that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber and irrigating rivers, but as fountains of life. And we see that quote on this slide. So inspired by that early and impactful visit and many more, Ansel Adams would devote his career to picturing nature's splendor. In 1930, he made many photographs of Yosemite while working for the Curry Company, which was promoting tourism in the region. And although this work was steady and it allowed Ansel Adams to create great photographs, he sometimes found himself caught between these goals of promoting visitation and promoting conservation. We have to remember that unlike Bierstadt, Adams was working in a West that was increasingly built. But in 1934, Ansel Adams was elected to the board of the Sierra Club, a position which allowed him to use his photographs more pointedly towards preservation ends. And this image of Yosemite's distinguished half dome, it's one of his most beautiful pieces and most famous works of the period. We see astounding clarity here and incredible tonal range. And these things are indicative of the photographer's ability to really convey the pristine quality of the land and allow for that spiritual encounter with it. And also during this time period, Adams had the opportunity to create a book titled Sierra Nevada, the John Muir Trail, which was used to actually lobby the Interior Secretary and President Franklin Roosevelt to create a national park in the Kings River region. And this idea was actually realized with the establishment of Kings Canyon National Park in 1940. And so, like the landscape painters who came before him, Ansel Adams was influencing public opinion with his art. And better still, these artworks were really resulting in policy change. The following year, Adams was commissioned to travel throughout the nation, photographing all sorts of beautiful sites under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior. This project was eventually actually halted due to changes in the funding structure in the government due to World War II, but it resulted in hundreds of amazing photographs of 48 states, including the pieces that you see on this slide. And these are photographs that remain iconic representations of landscape today. And we know that Adams would become and remain a politically active member of the Sierra Club and would continue to advocate for nature, for landscape through his photography. In 1968, he was awarded the Conservation Service Award, the Interior Department's highest civilian honor. And in 1980, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, also quite an amazing honor. And when receiving this honor, he was thanked for his, quote, efforts to preserve this country's wild and scenic area, both on film and on earth. Ansel Adams, whose career, his long career, which spanned, as you can see, many decades of the 20th century, I think functions as a helpful interpretive bridge between traditional depictions of landscape, like those that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, and the more radical ideas about land and landscape art that would characterize our modern and our postmodern age. And those who have studied art history know that by even the 1940s, American artists began to reject ideas about representation as the best mode for making artworks, making paintings, sculptures, etc. And by the 1960s and 70s, the emergence of earthworks and land art would break down this boundary of where art starts and nature starts and merge the two. So, or in other words, where nature ended and land began. While for Bierstadt and for Adams, land was subject matter. Artists such as Robert Smithson began to use land as subject and material. So Smithson's famous spiral jetty, which is pictured here, was a 1,500-foot long and 15-foot wide jetty built up of rocks and earth at an abandoned site at the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And the piece was actually informed by Smithson's study of geography. His knowledge that salt crystals would form around the edges of the jetty, creating this beautiful spiral. His understanding that the piece itself was ephemeral, that it would not last. And we know that Smithson photographed and videotaped this work extensively before it disappeared due to erosion, as was planned. And so from this work, we can assess that ephemerality and natural cycles of the land were really embedded in his approach. He was calling for an art in which land and artwork could become one. And also embedded in this approach was Smithson's call for artists to really begin to explore a symbiotic relationship with the land and to seek out visceral interactions with the landscape. Although Smithson's famous spiral jetty advocated for a new model of interacting with the land, his imagined piece, Floating Island, offered an even more direct critique of what he viewed as humanity's disconnect with the environment. Smithson sadly died in 1973 in a plane crash, but he left behind a number of unfinished ideas. And the sketch that you see on this slide is one of those. Floating Island was imagined as a huge rectangular barge that was filled with trees, plants, rocks, indigenous to Manhattan Island. And so this literal floating landscape was intended to be tugged around the island of Manhattan so that citizens and visitors could gaze upon it and consider what the land beneath their feet used to look like, as well as what had been displaced. And some 35 years after Smithson drew it, This project was actually realized. This was really built by the Whitney Museum of American Art and another group of collaborators. So for 9 days in the fall of 2005, a tugboat pulling a mini island circled the much larger, much more built island of Manhattan. And with the pressing need for preservation and the challenges of climate change becoming even more prevalent in 2005 and again more salient today, this work has sort of increased in its ability to provoke thought and to provoke consideration about the landscape and the land. So while we move away from traditional views of landscape, we see that many artists have followed Smithson's lead by building on this discussion of, and also an advocacy for, what has been lost or what could be lost. And so I want to show you a few works of art by John Quick-to-See Smith. She is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nation of Montana who creates artwork that evokes land and addresses this history of loss. Mixed media works like the one seen here, which is titled Indio-Indigenous of 1992, are what the artist refers to as narrative landscapes. And so here we are in 1992. We've moved quite far away from those early landscapes. Visually, this may not resemble the type of landscape that we're familiar with. Instead, it's a collage that includes things like the masthead of the artist's reservation newspaper, parts of a US map, comic strips, and drawn elements such as the bear and the deer. These all come together to create a sort of symbolic American landscape. And we see this dripping of paint throughout the canvas that may evoke a sort of melting. And through this complex arrangement of pictorial elements, the work aims to make a connection between the destruction of the land and the landscape and a marginalization of Native American populations. We see a similar use of maps and of symbols in this piece, which is called The Browning of America, also by Smith, and made in 2000, located at the Crocker Art Museum. It also uses, rather than recognizable forms of landscape, a map and symbols to evoke the past and also to prod at issues of our present. So if you look closely, you'll see below the outline of the continental United States, some collaged elements of newspaper clippings that allude to our country's history of colonialism. And these are again stained. And we see pictograms like the buffalo, which is positioned near Yellowstone, reminding us of a past in which the bison's historic dominance was prevalent on the plain, and in which we lived in a richer ecosystem. And the title of this work is important to come back to. Browning of America is multivalent. On one hand, as is alluded to by the elements of collage, it pushes against ideas that connect land and whiteness, ideas about manifest destiny. But it also reasserts Indigenous presence. It asserts the country's increasing diversity, while also referring to ideas about pollution, fossil fuels, greenhouse gases, all of these other things that cause browning. And so through this work, again, a complex network of symbols, Smith seems to be saying that the diversity of humanity, as well as the diversity of ecology and of landscape, are really necessary considerations for us as we all think about land, landscape, and the future of our nation. Another artist whose work calls attention to what could be lost due to climate change is the painter Marlene Yu. I was so fortunate to have the opportunity to meet Marlene Yu when she came to the museums last year to exhibit her work in Springfield. And this is an image from that installation, The Essence of Nature Paintings by Marlene Yu. Yu is fascinating, full of energy, and a force of nature herself. She studied Chinese brush painting and received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in Taipei before immigrating to the United States in 1963. And by 1967, she had received an MFA from the University of Colorado and become inspired by abstract expressionism, an American style of painting that embraced form and color and gesture as a means of conveying one's own interior thoughts and emotions. But rather than turning completely inward in her study of abstract expressionism, Marlene Yu looked outwards. And so today she continues to employ a fascinating technique that combines her interest in brushwork with abstraction, but looks at the natural world. Her primary source of inspiration has long been the natural world, and actually humanity's need to protect this world that we inhabit. And her call for a heightened awareness of environmental issues began as early as the 1960s, making her a pioneer in the green movement in art. In 1965, she began to create pieces in her glacier melting series. And this is a series that she continues today. The work that you see on the back wall of this photograph is a 2007 addition to the artist's glacier melting series. And you can get a sense from this photograph of the incredible scale and power of these works. When you stand in front of a piece, you are subsumed by it, and you are sort of forced to consider the landscape that is being presented to you, both the exterior landscape and your own emotional landscape as you encounter the work. Another work that was featured in that same exhibit in Springfield is Disappearing Forest 1 and 2, and we're so pleased that this has since entered our own collection at the Springfield Museums. This piece, as you can see, really two pieces that come together as one, incorporate beautiful, bold oranges and reds and purple with lighter forms that seem to resemble smoke. And though beautiful, there's an ominous quality to Disappearing Forest 1 and 2. It seems to both resemble and predict the increase in the frequency and severity of forest fires. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Western United States have experienced some of the warmest years on record in the last decade. And as we know, in California, 2020 was the largest wildfire season in modern history, with nearly 10,000 fires burning over 4.2 million acres. So as we were preparing to exhibit this piece, it was, just extremely relevant and visionary in its relevancy. And this piece, as you can see from the Marlene Yu quote that I've placed on this slide, is intended to be viewed not only as a rumination on climate change and extreme weather, but really as a call to action. Marlene Yu and her husband James Yu are definitely proponents of the idea that art and life should intersect. And they have actually started the Rainforest Art Foundation, which aims to increase the appreciation of nature through art. So Marlene Yu is doing this work of raising awareness both in her life and through her artwork, hoping that art can do this work of spreading awareness and promoting change. And I have just one more work of art to show you today. I want to look closely at this piece, which will close my lecture portion of the talk, because it's a work that moves beyond spreading awareness about environmental issues and actively cultivated the land that it occupied. What you're viewing is not a cornfield, as you may see from the caption, but what artist Lauren Bond describes as a living sculpture that was planted on a 32-acre plot of land in Los Angeles that had essentially been abandoned. And this was done from 2005 to 2006. It was realized with funding from the state of California, as well as some philanthropic organizations. And it turned this area of the city into an incredible site of growth. You can see the city skyline just peeking through the field of corn. It was a public artwork that helped to produce food, as well as to provide a habitat for hummingbirds, butterflies, and other animals. And it also functioned as a sort of community center, a place where those in the city could come together to have bike tours, to hold gardening classes, to hold performances. And visitors, as we're doing through this photograph, were invited to contemplate the scale of the cornfield as compared to that city skyline, and to think about the juxtaposition of those two things. It encouraged visitors also to think about plant life as really necessary for human existence. Sometimes that's something that we in our daily lives, especially our urban daily lives, can really forget about. But here, visitors were encouraged to witness the evolution of an ecosystem. At the end of the growing season in 2006, the corn was harvested, it was eaten, and the land was transformed into a park. So this is a living work of art that took a desolated plot of land and turned it into something vibrant, something community oriented, and something positive for our earth. It's one of several public art pieces, and I think we're seeing more and more of these today and in our contemporary era, that mixes art with urban planning, with community building, with landscape architecture, in order to imagine a better future where humans and landscapes can continue to coexist. So although this short dive into landscape and the land has by no means been comprehensive, as a comprehensive history of American art, I do hope that you've learned a few things, that you've come away with an expanded understanding of the way that artists have been and will continue to be storytellers and activists and change makers. Thank you so much for spending the time listening to me today, and I'm so excited to take your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Maggie. I just can't tell you how wonderful that was. It made me realize first that I really miss going to museums. We've lost so much this year, and I know you have opened your exhibits in a socially, in a responsible way, and so it's a really good service. What a pleasure to hear you talk. You've got so much knowledge and it's and passion, obviously, for the topic. So let me just start with my own personal thanks. I feel like it was just such a treat to see, and I'm sure a lot of the people on the webinar agree. Let me mention that again, that if you've got questions, we welcome them. There's a Q&A, a little Q&A spot at the bottom of your screen. Just enter your questions there, and we'll get to ask Maggie them. And I was curious, this is an area that you obviously know so much about. What got you interested in thinking about art as a vehicle for promoting environmentalism?
Well, thank you. This has been such a wonderful opportunity. And thank you for that question. I owe so much of what I know about this field to the scholars that have come before me. So Alan Braddock and others who have studied this connection between art and landscape extensively. I love books, and I'm so thankful for all of that scholarship. But in a direct answer to your question, I would actually say that the artwork that got me started in thinking about the connection between art and environmentalism was actually not a landscape. I was sitting in a lecture series in an undergraduate course on early 20th century American art, and I remember seeing photographs by the photographer and painter Charles Sheeler. And in the 1920s, he was actually commissioned to go to Detroit and to take photographs of a brand new Ford plant that had just been built. And this was in the machine age. So American artists were riled up about the power of technology and the way in which it could transform our country, and also the power of industry. And in looking at these photographs, clicking through the slides in the art history presentation, I remember my professor at that time putting them into this wonderful historical context. But as I was looking at the images, and they were images of factory buildings, often taken from a low angle so that they were sort of positioned in an exalted view, I remember that all I could think about was pollution. I was looking at smokestacks, I was looking at machinery, I was looking at assembly lines, and I noticed that this wasn't really being addressed. And so I kept thinking about this, and I think that it really was the moment at which I started to seek out other scholarship that addressed this issue of how does the environment interact with our ideas about American art, and how can we maybe tell a more complete story through our own contemporary lens. And of course, when I arrived at the Springfield Museums in 2014, we had this amazing collection of Hudson River School paintings and 19th century landscape paintings. And so I think that's when I again started to pick up this topic. And certainly preparing for this lecture has allowed me to dive even deeper. So a long way of saying that it's been a journey, but that I think this eco-critical lens, though applied to landscapes incredibly and appropriately, can actually be applied to other artwork as well.
I think that's probably right. I mean, a lot of what you've talked about today was really provocative and interesting to think about, how those early artists were really trying to influence policy. And that's, I know about that, of course, in my introduction, I talked about it from the context of the evolution of the conservation movement. And that was fraught, right? It was fraught with this idea of manifest destiny. And then you look at that Browning of America piece was just really incredible. Like, it made you think. So it's that mixture of thinking and feeling that art does for us, right? That is so important in environmentalism. I was thinking about a quote that we protect the things we love, but we only love the things we know. And so it's like, how do we know the environment? Like, I believe that we really need to protect the environment. And so how do we reach more people to get them to know the environment? And it had been through art originally. And it's interesting to think about this evolution of art over time, from the idealized landscape now to community art. And do you have any observations or thoughts about that to share?
Yeah, I think that history that you bring up is so fascinating, and what so many of the modern and contemporary pieces that we looked at today, what I come away from those pieces with is this idea that we need to continually revisit the past in order to understand where we are and how we understand our physical landscape as well as the depictions of landscape today. And I think Browning of America does that in a way that is beautiful and complicated. We sometimes need these complicated narratives in order to create a larger picture. And I think that what art can do and what has done throughout centuries is, as you said beautifully in your introduction, elicit an emotional response from us. Sometimes when we're looking at charts and we're reading the data, we don't have that opportunity to really commune with art in the way that we might go out on a hike and commune with nature. And I think those emotional responses to paintings, whether they're the monumental works that Albert Bierstadt would have presented to his colleagues in New York, or an encounter with a cornfield in the middle of Los Angeles.
I love that one.
There are elements that, even if we just read about them, even if we do just see pictures, they stay with us, I think, on an emotional level.
Well, I'm a lawyer, right? That's my background. I don't know if you know that, but I'm a lawyer, and I've been deep in policy. And a lot of what we often struggle with is, how do we get people to care on that deep level? Like, these are complex issues. And so I like what you just said about complexity, and how art can bring us up through the complexity to what those core feelings are and the core values, like what it makes us feel, how we experience the world can be impacted through the lens of art. It's really, I hadn't thought about that before today. So thank you for that. We get convinced in different ways, and these issues are complex, right? Climate change, really complicated. Thinking about urbanization, really complicated. So we've got a bunch of questions I want to get to. One is, are you working with any local or Massachusetts artists to encourage them to do this kind of art?
Well, one of the things that I'm so grateful to have been a part of during this difficult year of the pandemic is a community call for portraiture at the Springfield Museums. And, jumping to another genre from landscape to portraiture, we had invited contemporary artists living in our local region to submit portraits to us, which we displayed in our community gallery. And these portraits that came in were astounding. So many of them had to do with social justice, with the pandemic experience, but also with our connection to the environment. And one of the wonderful pieces that did come in was by an artist, Mage Evers, who is local to Western Massachusetts. And she creates cyanotypes. So she goes out, she collects flowers, mushrooms, all sorts of beautiful things from nature, and then incorporates them into her naturally created photographic pieces. And she created a work for the exhibition This Is Us Regional Portraiture Today that was it's actually a silhouetted figure of a person, but it also incorporates ideas about social justice and about how we as people must always be connected to our landscape and to the nature that is around us. So I think that's just one example, but certainly we are so excited to work with artists in our area and throughout the nation who are interested in these ideas and are pursuing them. We're also thrilled that in Springfield, one of our public parks has just been redone, and the city has done a call for art for that public park as well. And so I think we're going to see more and more artists addressing the issues that are important to them today. And climate change really is coming to the fore, I think has been for a while, but with a new generation of artists, it's becoming increasingly important and is ripe for these community exhibitions and also for public spaces.
That's very interesting. In the Nature Conservancy, I know some of our sister chapters, like in Vermont, they just started a project with the Arts Council where they're bringing in artists to one of the preserves who's going to be doing some sort of, exhibit that really is grounded in that particular landscape and that particular location. And so it's public art in public spaces, and public art actually deep in nature, can be very profound, I think, too. Very, absolutely. Very cool. There was a question from Steve Olszewski, and he asks if you're familiar with similar environmental art and artists from Europe or Asia, or is this unique to the United States?
That's a great question. I focused on the United States today because that's my area of specialty, but climate change, as we know, is a global crisis. It's a global problem. And so there are artists all over the world who are addressing these issues and are incorporating land and landscape into their art. And one artist that I often bring up, I didn't in this presentation because he's a British artist, but is Andy Goldsworthy. And you may have seen his work.
I love him.
I always think of his work. He's an artist, interestingly. It's always so fascinating to think about how artists come to their study of art. He is somebody who worked on a farm for many years before studying art. And he creates artwork, much like the Robert Smithson piece that we saw, land art pieces that are created from leaves, from twigs, anything that he finds in his environment, he uses to then draw attention to the environment. So absolutely look up Andy Goldsworthy. I love his work. And certainly many other artists are doing this around the world. One of my favorite ways of finding new artists is actually using social media and following the National Park Service, following National Geographic is a great way to discover artists and especially photographers, I think, who are traversing the globe and doing this kind of work. So if folks don't know about Andrew Goldsworthy, you really have to look him up when we're done. It's phenomenal. Like, he just creates these amazing sculptures out of natural objects, but it's ephemeral art. It's right. Going to be gone. And that's part of like the magic of it. And we did get a question from Becky Ikahara from I think your area, actually. I think she lives in
in around Springfield. And she asks, is there a tension in the museum world between the mission to curate and preserve art and the environmental artist's impulse to create artworks that are ephemeral, like the spiral jetty and like the work of Goldsworthy, where we know the wind's gonna come and all those leaves are gonna blow away. I'm interested to know what you think. Like, is there a tension that you see?
One of the most talked about topics in the world of art conservation today is how do we preserve art that is not meant to be preserved? Artists today are not using necessarily the traditional materials of bronze or of oil on canvas, materials that we can easily place in a climate controlled vault and ensure the preservation of. Artists today are using sticks, they're using rocks, they're using styrofoam, they're using video, they're using digital photography. And so this is a really large conversation in the museum world about how do we preserve these things and do we preserve these things? I think there's always a balance that must be found between the intentions of the artist and the desire to carry on their legacy and to carry on their story. So absolutely, I think it's something that museums and conservationists are grappling with today as they receive works in new media and in ephemeral media. But as much as technology and new materials are making this more difficult, they're also allowing us through photography and film to preserve ephemeral artworks in a different way.
Yeah. And so that's like Banksy,
Yes.
right? So I don't know if people here remember that Banksy is an artist who it's street art, like, and it's kind of guerrilla street art because he just goes out and draws a Banksy piece on some building somewhere. But he also, is very well known and sold a piece of work for I don't know how many millions of dollars.
Millions.
And as soon as it was taken, it was shredded. It went through a shredder, and which was amazing. Like, it's provocative in that same way as this idea of art as ephemeral, and very, very provocative. Because of course, in nature, nature is pretty ephemeral too. It's always changing, right? It's just always changing. So there was a question from Leslie Pond asking, what are the recent powerful examples of artists collaborating with others like activists and policymakers, communities, to affect change, whether at the local, national, or global level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are so many of these. I wish I could do justice to all of them. But one that comes to mind for me, and which is familiar, I'm sure, to many who are on this webinar today, is the example of the High Line in New York City. This was really an abandoned elevated railway that was slated for demolition and for increased building and industrialization of this area. But because of a group of community activists who eventually came together with the city, the High Line was able to be saved and was able to be turned into not only a piece of public artwork that functioned as a walkway above the city, in which, a little bit like that cornfield piece we saw, those who encountered it and spent time with it would be encouraged to contemplate their place in the city. And the High Line was also turned into a green space. So cultivated on the High Line are many plants and even mini environments for birds and different animals. And so I think this concept of creating green spaces that both bring awareness to our ideas about how we can interact with the landscape in our daily lives, but actually also then create more landscape, are really, really powerful. And so that's one that I think about a lot. And all of this talk is making me want to travel, making me want to go see the High Line and many other urban spaces. But absolutely, I think there are a lot of projects like this which are becoming intersectional. Art is not, as we're learning, about something that hangs on the wall anymore. It can be that, but it can also be something that we walk across, something that we breathe in.
So Russ Cohen made a comment that was sort of in taking this to the next level. He said there's a branch of environmental art where the art pieces themselves are designed to not only raise public awareness of an environmental issue, but that the art itself is intended to have a beneficial effect of mitigating the problem, at least to some modest symbolic degree. And that's what you're describing. And he mentions that one that immediately comes to mind is Buster Simpson's Rolades for Rivers, an environmental performance art done to raise public awareness of acid rain. And I actually, when I was Secretary of the Environment of Vermont, I actually represented Vermont at the Paris Climate Accords with all of the different states. And there was a really moving piece of art right in the middle of one of the squares in Paris. They brought a piece of the glacier. The artist came and brought a big piece of the glacier and put it in a square, and artists did art around it, and it slowly melted over the course of the summit. And that was a very moving and impactful piece of art, and it got a lot of recognition. Again, ephemeral, not necessarily mitigating a problem, but at least pointing to a problem through art.
And very visceral too, I'm sure, to encounter that on your daily walk would be quite something, and also to encounter it over and over again. And I did want to mention in my research today, I came across this wonderful database, which is called Curating Cities. You can Google it online, but it's all about these public art projects. And I believe actually that ICE project was highlighted on their website. So
that would make sense.
It just reminded me. I'm glad you brought it up.
One of our attendees also noted that it's really interesting that the intentional ephemerality of some art is that with social media, Snapchat and Instagram and those sorts of things, these expressions make us actually see life and see art a little differently. We have so many images coming to us, or we're experiencing so much of the world filtered through these ephemeral social media, moments. Do you have any thoughts about how that intersects with this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. In the past year, museums across the nation, including the Springfield Museums, have been increasing our digital footprint. We're putting more and more online. And I think that the internet and social media can be an amazing tool for introducing us to works of art. But as I think this inquirer noted, it can also be overstimulating in terms of the amount of images that are coming at you at every moment. And so I think that the best, in my opinion, I think that the best projects of social media which highlight art are those that do encourage you to just stop and look and think about a single piece for a while. And I do hope that those introductions via social media, via the web, encourage people to get out there and see the real thing. And by the real thing, I mean both the Rockies and the painting of the Rockies.
Thank you. I like that.
It can go either way, but I think that art is an experience in itself, but is larger than that. It is created through artists' experiences and can encourage us to create our own experiences.
Yeah, I would agree. And hopefully art inspires us also to engage in the world in a different way, whether going to the Rockies or being active on policy or in our communities. There were a couple of questions about the Springfield Museum itself, and what have you been working on this past year? You've got a floral art display in April. Is that going to be available virtually for folks who still can't really come out in person? What are you looking forward to in the coming year? Maybe we're heading to the end, so that might be a great way to lead us to a wrap up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for asking. We have a number of really exciting programs at the Springfield Museums. We do have our annual Festival of Flowers, which was put on hold last year, but is coming back in wonderful bloom this April. We're also hosting a virtual Earth Day. And so both the Festival of Flowers and our Earth Day celebration will have online components. So I do encourage folks to check out our website. And we're so excited about the exhibition offerings that we have both right now. We're highlighting portraiture at the moment, and we have an amazing portraiture exhibition from the Smithsonian, which is involved with contemporary work that addresses issues of our day. And this summer, we'll be highlighting the internationally renowned artist and social activist Ai Weiwei in an exhibition. So we're so excited to promote that as well. And I think it's a great tie-in to this idea of art and activism connecting that we've been talking about today. So I thank you so much for asking. We welcome visitors in person. We are open to the public at the Springfield Museums, and we welcome visitors to our website as well. We hope you'll be in touch if you have any questions.
That's great. And how can people find you to stay up to date with your work?
Absolutely. Springfieldmuseums.org is a great way to find me and find many of my colleagues who are doing fantastic work. I also recommend checking us out on social media.
Well, that's wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us today. It really has been a pleasure hearing you talk. You're so knowledgeable, and it really was a treat just getting to see art in the middle of the day. I want to thank everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. I need to say your support is what makes all of this work possible. So thank you. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. And if you're enjoying our webinars, please feel free to share them with your friends or make a donation to support our work. And you can donate. There's a link in the chat that'll tell you where you can donate. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and to get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. And we're off next week, but I want to let you know about our event on Thursday, March 8th. It's really an exciting project we're going to be talking about. It's one of our new initiatives at TNC to help struggling oyster farmers who have been impacted by COVID-19. You might have heard about it already because it was actually featured on the Today Show and in the Boston Globe and on WBUR. We're going to be joined by Steve Kirk. He's our Coastal Program Manager for TNC in Massachusetts, and he's going to give us an update on the program. And then we're going to have Robert Jones, who's TNC's Global Lead for Aquaculture. And he's going to talk about how TNC's oyster restoration work is progressing across the country. You know, we know what we do here in Massachusetts. We scale through our networks, our TNC networks across the country and across the world. We're also going to be joined by a very special guest, Massachusetts oyster farmer Bruce Silverbrand. He's the owner of Buttermilk Bay Oysters, and he's been part of our initiative and was featured in the Globe and on WBUR. So he'll talk about what this program means for him as a practical matter, why it's really good for not just the fishing industry, but also ocean health. And you're not going to want to miss this, I don't think. So as always, you can find the latest webinar schedule and register at nature.org, MA webinars. And thank you once again, Maggie, for joining us. It's really been great to have you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.